get started. So really excited to be on this panel. And what I will start out by saying is we are one down a panelist. Dr. Subini Annamma is not going to be able to join us today, so we're going to try to channel her energy and spirit. It's particularly important for me to center her work because I was actually going to build on so much of what she was about to say, because I have tried mightily and with her assistance to bring in disability critical race theory into American law and the study of legal doctrine. And so I was going to build on much of what Subini was going to say today. So what we're going to do is basically talk from our own vantage points in practice in law and doctrine about how to think about disability critical race theory as a part of a broader project to abolish the carceral state. And so because we are down one person, we're going to probably try to build in a little bit more time for discussion. So please hold us to that. We're going to keep it collaborative, but we'll also have 3 presentations. I think we're planning about, maybe 10 minutes each. Yeah. We'll have slides for Vivian's presentation, but maybe, he said maybe, let's hope we do, but we'll go ahead and get started. So one of the things that I think is super important to note is that critical race theory, why we're all here, is a methodology, and the trajectories of critical race theory have been really varied and profound. We can think about empirical critical race theory. I know there are many empiricists in the room. Queer crit. We can think about TribalCrit, LatCrit, most iconically, I think, in terms of the connections to critical race theory, and then also disability critical race theory, which we'll call DisCrit for short, in the lineage that Subini, Dr. Annamma, left for us in her work with Beth Connor and David Connor and Beth Ferry. I always mix those two up. So one of the things to think about is that in our work, we're attempting to bring in insights from critical race theory to understand disability as a site of contestation, the construction of power within systems that oppress people with disabilities, people of color, and people at the intersection. And so when you think about disability critical race theory, they're bringing in key insights from critical race theory to understand and unpack disability. So the first thing I'd like to say is maybe to start out with what we can think of as like the 3 core tenets of disability critical race theory. I'll sort of talk about how I've applied those 3 tenets to the work. And then I want to kind of pick up and tell you what the other tenets of disability critical race theory are. I'm just going to say DisCrit, if that's okay, if I could shorten it. First point, any access needs in the room. Am I speaking loudly for everybody? Everyone can hear. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk theory for a little bit, and then I'm going to try to apply it to some of the work. So one of the things that we know as critical race theorists is that race is a social construction and that the law plays a role in constructing it. It's the sort of theoretical, foundational critique of critical race theory. Disability law scholars have also, and disability studies, importantly, informs disability law. Critical disability studies grows out of disability studies. And then we can think of DisCrit as an attempt to bring in discussions of race into these critical accounts of disability. What we're seeing in those discourses is a similar move, that disability is also a social construction. Right? It's a rejection, if you will, of what are the dominant ways of thinking about disability. The dominant ways of thinking about disability come through things known as either the medical model or the biological model of disability. So an important first move to understand DisCrit and Dr. Annamma's intervention into the literature is to really understand that impairments in bodies and minds are more than the physical manifestation that we might see, but they're the social meanings that attach to those impairments, and therefore the responses that we might see in the form of either accommodation or the inability, unwillingness to accommodate can be seen as a response to the social meaning of difference. So one example is I have an eye impairment. I have a lot of impairments, but let's just say this is the one that's most visible to you all. All right, I have an eye impairment and I'm accommodating with eyeglasses, so I can now not see anything, and then I can see everybody in the back row now. right? So the glasses, if you think about it, are in a kind of accommodation. In the disability law language, we would call it a reasonable accommodation. My wearing the glasses isn't fundamentally altering the way that we're receiving content in this room. And then my eye impairment is a disability medical one, right? There's numbers behind that. But my impairment has been normalized such that wearing glasses is of no moment, right? We wear it, we're not disrupting anybody. It's not a political statement to wear glasses in a classroom setting or any setting for that matter. You can also think beyond that. Think about the kinds of disabilities and the requested accommodations that would pose fundamental alteration. So we're in a room right now that doesn't look accessible to me just looking at the steps. If you had a physical disability, you wouldn't be able to enter the room, right? So it's inaccessible to people with physical disabilities, wheelchair users, individuals that use walkers and the like. So the social meaning, one might say, of the impairment, it's not that there's anything intrinsically wrong about the person that can't access the room in terms of the physical impairment. It's just that we haven't provided accommodation so that they can access it, right? So what we start to see is that there's a social meaning that attaches to the certain bodies and minds that are not accommodated in spaces, and then political choices behind the failure to accommodate. So that's sort of, to my mind, what disability studies destabilizes when you think about what comes before disability studies, which are departments that are launched in the early 1990s, starting probably around the time that the ADA is enacted. What does DisCrit offer us? In many discussions of disability, you see a number of sort of limitations. So one, there's not much discussion. If we recognize disability as a social construction, one thing that we'll note is that not all disabilities are created equally, right? The reaction one might have, let's imagine that we take the position of a police officer. Much of my work looks at disability policing, which I'll talk about later. Disabilities look different to police officers, and you think about that in terms of the disproportionate likelihood of dying in a police encounter when you're a person with a disability, I think in many ways, and we need more empirical research here, we can talk about that later, but in many ways it's informed by your disability presentation. So you might be autistic, you might have an intellectual or developmental disability, and in response to an officer command, you might not react as the officer terms appropriately, quickly enough. You might stutter, you might stammer, which might lead to constructions of suspicion. Imagine that you're an individual that has Down syndrome. I'm thinking of Ethan Saylor. Ethan Saylor was a 20-something-year-old who was in the movie theaters in Maryland. He, like many of us did back then, stuck around for a second movie without paying. Some concerned citizen called the police on Ethan, and Ethan was accosted by police officers. He wasn't able to conform his body as quickly as they ordered him to their demands. And quite tragically, if you look at the story, he ends up asphyxiating in a chokehold by the police officers, right? Because he couldn't quite respond quick enough to their orders. His lack of comprehension on account of intellectual and developmental disability was interpreted, I see Eric just walked in, as resistance, who's done a lot of work on that, right? So in many ways, disabilities read differently when you think across disability classes, and we know this intervention, they read differently when you think about intersectional factors, right? Class, age, gender, of course, sexual orientation. They can change the character of the perception of disability, and of course, the way that law is going to operate now through the bodies of disabled people. So Annamma, Connor, and Ferry, and I must say, I read this in 2013, and I kid you not, I read this in law school, right? Because look at the bio, right? I graduated 2013, and I emailed Subini out of the blue, like, this paper has changed my life. It was the creepiest email I ever sent because it was a cold call. And Subini responded. And from there, we were able to just develop a kind of rich bond talking about race and disability. She was influential, and how Subini's in San Francisco. I just want to be clear, but like I want to talk about her here. Yeah. She was influential in helping me launch the center, because one of the things that they wrote in this book, it was a key insight, article, then became 2 books after. Racism and ableism are normalizing processes that are interconnected and collusive, right? So that was profound to me, because I talked about how intersectionality can shape how disability shows up in the world and its recognition, lack thereof, responses with force. They tell us that racism validates and reinforces ableism, right? Ableism validates and reinforces racism. It's a kind of collusive system. So we might have an understanding of racism. To add ableism to that, we can think about ableism as a kind of devaluing of bodies and minds that can't conform to the norm, that can't conform to the norm of performance, behavior, social setting. I mean, everyone's so politely sitting quietly and, not moving to, these are social norms that are coercive. I mean, at my age, your back hurts if we sit like this all day, right? So think about what we're doing in terms of enforcing physically this norm on our body. That kind of ableism, again, it's not the intentional discrimination against people with disabilities, although we surely see that, insert HHS, and everything that they have said in the last, 9 months. But it can also be these subversive mechanisms that show up in social practices and across institutional settings. So Annamma et al. Tell us racism and ableism, in addition to being collusive, is also enmeshed in the social fabric, the fabric of our social order. They appear both normal and natural to people in this in this culture. When we add racism to it, we start to see a different flavor in many ways. So one thing to think about is like the complexities. I think if most of us were to think about ableism society, I would imagine if we encountered it, we would have encountered it in the discussion of eugenics, right? And Annamma also talks about this. What we've been told is that was a white supremacist racial project. Indeed it was. But the targets of this, and Kira Bridges has written about this, were individuals that you could say were white people that were viewed as marginally white, or in some way kind of on the periphery of whiteness. They were the targets of the height of the eugenics period, meaning in terms of just the raw numbers, they were the number that were forcibly sterilized at the highest sort of aggregate rates across the country. That apparatus, as we can see, that when the state coercive apparatus is built up, it can be deployed to different groups. That's the apparatus that shifts to the bodies of women of color, Black women in particular, Latina women. We can see the Mississippi appendectomy, the GOA report that talks about 1 in 4 Puerto Rican women being sterilized in the 60s and the 70s. But in the era of eugenics, the target was on white bodies because they were corrupting this broader national political project of creating the ideal citizen, right? If we think about the height of the eugenics period, late 19th century into the kind of Great Depression period, into like the 1920s, at many of the schools that we would think of as the prestigious elite schools, it was about trying to suppress the defective, in the terms of the day, genes of disabled people. Disability at the time was very capacious, and it included survivors of sexual violence, individuals with feminine physique, in the terms of one statute, which referred to men that were socialized, right? Perceived to have feminine traits. It referred to individuals who were illiterate, and anyone that had any kind of physical impairment, right? These were individuals that were excluded from the borders. Douglas Banton's Defectives in the Land tells that story. And they were also seen to kind of corrupt the actual national order and be dregs on the public fisc, because these were people that were going to get sick on account of their disabled bodies and drain resources from the state. When you add racism to the story, we can take it back even further. Dee Boster's work talks about this, Stephanie Barclay. In the period of chattel slavery, I should have issued the trigger warning, but a lot of what I write about is very heavy, so with apologies. But we have to tell the story, I think, to understand DisCrit and its brilliance. But in the period of chattel slavery, when you think about the actual measurement and evaluation of enslaved Black people, having disabilities discounted literally their value on the market, right? Being an individual of unsound mind. You can actually look at these cases. I wrote a paper called On the Relationship Between Race and Disability and spent a lot of time in this record. But the unsound mind became a basis for discounting the value of an enslaved person. We also know from Harriet Washington's work, the impulse, the desire to freedom and to want to run away was medicalized as an individual psychological pathology. Drapetomania was the condition of wanting to escape enslavement. So race comes in, and in many ways, the project of white supremacy trades on these racist and ableist tropes in order to maintain a social order. After the period of chattel slavery, you see the same thing. The vagrants of the time were individuals that were, yes, labeled as unemployed, but we're also constructed in many ways as lazy and indolent. You see a lot of that language if you look to Kelly Lytle Hernandez's book about who built the city of Los Angeles. The vagrants that were arrested were in many ways cast as disabled. So I think what we get from DisCrit is trying to bring in racism and ableism as these collusive agents to inform how disabled bodies, when thought of intersectionally, are perceived by law and what renders them vulnerable. So now I'm going to shift to like what I get from DisCrit and how I apply it to my work. If I haven't already communicated it, it's been very influential. It changed literally how I think about disability, race, and both in tandem. So in a lot of my work, I argue that what DisCrit gives us is a theoretical framework for understanding how laws function, not only to construct racial categories, but also to construct the definition and boundaries of disability. So in a lot of my work, I'm trying to understand this idea of the legal construction of disability. If I've told you it's a social construction, then law can play a role in constructing what we think about as disability, and also then what is seen as an appropriate accommodation to that disability. If it goes beyond the bounds of reasonableness under our disability laws, the state, the employer, the place of public accommodation is not entitled to accommodate it, right? So it leaves a lot of people in that gap of underprotection and lack of coverage. So I'm going to take the 3 DisCrit tenets, and am I good on time?
Yeah.
Okay, I just need like 10 minutes. Okay, I'm just going to take the, yes.
Just quick, was there a presentation that's supposed to
No,
be?
I know. We were gonna keep it conversational, and then I took it there because Subini was gonna lay it out. I just want to be clear. I'm trying to fill in big shoes, so kind of winging it. Okay, so I'm gonna just lay it out, and then. But I highly encourage you to read. It's a 2013 article by Subini Annamma, Beth Ferry, and David Connor, and you're gonna see these tenets. So I'm going to just talk about 3 because there's about 8 of them. So here's how we're going to do this. One of the things to know about DisCrit is it's a principled method and it can be applied. So we get this also from Devin Carbato's critical what. Please think about CRT as a methodology that you can apply in your work, right? As opposed to just it being a theory that we can debate and love endlessly, but it's actually pretty precise. So I'm only going to speak to the first 3 tenets and how I've taken those tenets and applied them to the work. But again, it's a short article, probably like 20 pages. You can get the full scope. All right, so the first DisCrit tenet states that to apply DisCrit, right, and its underlying insights, we have to focus on the interdependent ways that racism and ableism shape now notions of what they call normalcy. Remember I told you what we can think of as disabilities are deviations from the norm. All right, so DisCrit then offers a lens from which to examine the ways in which racism and ableism are mutually constitutive processes that are enacted through normalizing practices and that reinforce the unmarked norms of whiteness. Now note the move there. We've talked about normalcy. What Annamma gives us is now the recognition and the insight that in many ways the norm is whiteness, and to be clear, white able-bodiedness, meaning if you are not white and able-bodied, you are not in the norm, you are deviant, you are defective, you are subject to regulation, forcible sterilization, exclusion from the border. By the way, we see this happening now, right? The public charge, surgencies, the discrimination against immigrants accessing the country with potential disabilities or health conditions. All right. So when I take this and I look at criminal law, I see DisCrit analysis everywhere. Examining disorderly conduct laws, I found that courts tend to ignore the ways in which the notion of disorder, think about it, what does it mean to be engaging in disorderly conduct? I would imagine many of us have been disorderly and in ways violating these laws, after a fun night out, let's just say. But that notion where the harm is inflicted is when you think about disorder as itself rooted in racialized, gendered, and ableist notions of order, which is why you see disorderly conduct as the leading charge for individuals experiencing or labeled as experiencing mental health crisis, right? In a society that has decided that it's an appropriate response to an individual mental health crisis to respond with law enforcement, a punitive response indeed, right? And indeed, if you look to the administration's current policies and the executive order, it's like law, order, and something else in the title, The solution to the problem of homelessness, of which is cast in this frame as a disorder, is not more housing, but is civil commitment, a psychiatric response, a kind of exercise of biopower, if you will, in response to the problem, which is quote unquote mentally ill and sheltered people. We've just cast the problem of homelessness and lack of housing as one of mental illness. All right, so we can see, if we think of the kind of mutually constitutive processes that Annamma talks about, the disorderly conduct laws is a regime that is about policing the boundaries of normalcy. You cannot scream in crisis on a public bus, or if you're Jordan Neely, what was it, the metro train, subway train in New York City, or you risk death in that case at the hands of a private individual, but certainly the hands of the police. So DisCrit tenet number 2, and I'm only going to go through 3, acknowledges the multidimensional identities, intersectionality, instead of the singular notions of identity such as race, disability, social class, and gender. All right, so how can we apply this, again, into the lens of policing, my own work? Thinking intersection about disability, I'm going to argue changes the nature of disability, disability discrimination, and subordination. All right, how? One of the things that's interesting and tragic when you read these policing cases is a few things. One, there are cases where disability is not recognized, and I submit it would be recognized if it showed up in different bodies. So when disability is completely not seen by the police, by the concerned relative, in most cases it's family, but we're going to talk about cases where it's about an individual that's in a public space, right? And there's not someone that knows him that can attest. So I'm thinking in this case of Elijah McClain. Elijah McClain's disability is not seen. In fact, his accommodation is not seen. He's wearing a ski mask in the middle of August because he has anemia. I have anemia, which is why my hands are cold all the time. And he had anemia and it made his face cold. So he's wearing a ski mask. He's listening to his music like most of us do. He's singing along to the music he's listening to. And there goes the concerned citizen again, calls the police because Elijah McClain is reportedly acting sketchy. Many of you know, like, the tragedy that ensues afterwards. He's stopped by the police. It's an impermissible stop. That's what we find out by the attorney. I think it's the Inspector General's office that does the report, but there's a massive report that you can look online. There's no reasonable suspicion for the stop, but he's stopped. He says, essentially something to the effect like, I have the right to do what I need to do. Just, leave me on my way. I'm not bothering anybody. He's subdued and administered an excessively high dose of ketamine and is killed. All right, so not recognized. I'm thinking about the Sandra Massey case in this light too, right? She calls for help, right? This is the current case in Illinois being litigated. The officer is facing charges for murder. She calls for help. The officer responds, and within seconds, minutes, alleges that Massey attempted to throw hot water on him. They have a threatening, sort of a back and forth where he alleges that he was threatened. It's all on video. And then the tragedy ensues. Sandra is killed. Right? So disability is not recognized even in the context of a welfare check. Right? So you have to wonder, what is the role that race is playing to erase what should be, if we looked at the 911, dispatch? This is a wellness call, dude. Like, why was it responded to? Anyway. All right, so next is where you have the disability is claimed, but not believed. Again, I'm submitting that when you think about race, this happens often for disabled people of color. I'm thinking of Clifford Owensby. There's a video of this as well. Clifford Owensby is stopped outside of a purported drug house. He has paraplegia. The police want to do a search of his vehicle. He's ordered out of the vehicle. He says, I'm going to need help getting out of the vehicle. I'm attempting to comply with your order. I'm going to need to get help out the vehicle because I can't walk. They don't believe him. They drag him out the vehicle by his locks. And then, again, 2 black officers in that case. And then proceed to just drag him down the street. Because he's being, at that, again, belligerent, he's resisting the order. He is never believed for the disability that he claims. And then the last category is where disability is a basis for hypersurveillance, which I always tell my students, when you claim disability in a workplace, the social meanings will attach to it. When you tell an officer that you have a disability, don't expect that to help you in every case, right? That you will get perhaps a public health response as opposed to a punitive carceral one. I think of Deborah Danner. Again, in the Deborah Danner case, if you're familiar with that case from 2016, Deborah Danner had been visited by the same NYPD unit, the emotionally disturbed person so-called unit, about 4 prior times. On the 4th time it goes wrong, there's an encounter. The officers allege that Deborah Danner picked up a bat and threatened them, and then they shoot and take her life. But you have to, again, understand, her disability was claimed, but in that case, it became a basis for hyper-surveillance, hyper-vigilant. The officers said they were nervous because they knew how unstable she was, how difficult she had been on the prior times before. It becomes a basis for more violence. So I think what I'm getting at is that when we think about race, it's not just that we're thinking about disability in a static way, but we're thinking about the racialized social meanings that attach to that particular impairment, that expression, that behavior, and how it shows up in the world, and how it might render people vulnerable to violence. I also talk about how it renders them less protected under the Fourth Amendment in a paper called Disability's Fourth Amendment. So lastly, I would just say that, as I've stated before, DisCrit helps us to reject the kind of bio-constructions of race that we see, as well as the biological constructions of disability, and the notion that disability really, we should try to center the notion that disability is really about society's responses to differences from the norm. It's not to say that experiences of pain are not real and that treatment should not be an option where it is sought on a voluntary basis. Right? We can think about why we're in a position of having to respond coercively. It's because we've created the point of crisis, to Jisun, your work, right? You create the crisis, therefore you need police to respond to the crisis that you have created by failing to invest in chronic care, community-based services. So we can learn that disability is a lens for analysis when it is thought about and constructed as an intersectional identity, and how it can render people with disabilities, people of color, and those at the intersection vulnerable to stops, frisks, arrest, and even death at the hand of law enforcement. When it comes to legal doctrine, there is no reasonable disabled person. There is the reasonable person who needs to understand that at the point that they feel like they have no right to leave, that's the point of detention. That's the point where the Fourth Amendment rights kick in. There's no recognition of the ways in which a person with a disability might, again, it's not to essentialize, but it's to think about how, in this example, intellectual disability shows up differently, might actually try to submit to the authority of the officers, to please the officers, as opposed to sort of asserting their rights, right? So the kind of free to leave test is more complex when you think about the capacities of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I could go on for, days, but I'll stop there and encourage you to read the article, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamelia. I'm gonna situate my presentation in a couple of different categories, and so I'll just kind of walk you through what I'm gonna do in the little time that we have. I want to talk first about how I came to this work, which was personal, which I think is a lot of how we come to this space. Then I want to talk about how the cases that I had here when I was a faculty member here at UCLA influenced my decision to write. So I'm sort of an accidental academic. I came to academia sort of after I thought about the advocacy work that I want to do. And I tell that story because I think it's an important one to tell in this space for people that might not have started in academia or want to start in academia, that you can come to this work in many different ways. And then I came to the scholarship, and I'll talk about my scholarship and how that then kind of was influenced by all the time that I spent. I was 16 years here at UCLA, so I was influenced by all the greats that you heard talking, and then some, and people that are in this room as well today. And then I'm going to talk about my current research, which is where there are gaps. Because what you realize, as you've heard Jamelia say, as you're going to hear, as I'm sure many of you know if you do this work, is we don't know enough information about the communities that we want to serve. We don't know about it from a policy perspective to fund them. We don't know it from an academic perspective. And so I'll talk about how the research that I'm doing now is to try to fill those gaps. So I'll kind of orient. So personally, I have a child who's now in college, but when he was preschool, I was advised that he wouldn't be ready for kindergarten. And the preschool teachers were like, we're not really sure what he has, but there's something going on. I suggest you take him to a pediatrician and figure it out. Go see my wonderful pediatrician, who was a Black woman who I really trusted, who said, I don't really see anything wrong with him, but if you want me to label him, I can, and all the insurance will kick in for all the sort of services that you may need. But you and I both know, she said, that you don't want that, because if he gets that label, it will follow him forever. And I was a civil rights lawyer, I did children's rights work, and I was like, I have no idea what she's talking about. Like, she's talking to me as if I should know something, and I don't know what she's saying. And so it was sort of my first orientation to labeling. Like, how are we labeling? So it speaks to kind of this otherness Jamila is talking about, that Dr. Annamma talks about. It's this othering that I heard about really early on. So fast forward to I start teaching here at UCLA. I start a clinic here at UCLA called the Youth and Justice Clinic, where we represent children in their criminal cases, and we're trying to use special education and education laws to try to mitigate, right? So to try to say to the judges, like, but for your failure to address these issues, these children should not be in this system. And I mean, everybody here is nodding their head. Disproportionately that children inside the juvenile delinquency system have one or more unmet, disability or special education or social emotional learning issue that hasn't been identified. So I had to sort of learn, so it was the cases then that drove me. Why is it that every single case we had, without fail, a student had a disability, like a disability designation? Either it was labeled or it was unlabeled. Like, it was clear that it was there and it wasn't marked, or it was marked in a way that I was like, this doesn't feel accurate. Like, this does not fit what this child seems to have. Not that I'm not an expert, but I can bring in experts, and the experts are telling me this is not. So what is happening? What is this phenomenon that is continually happening, and why are we continuing to feed it? Which is then where the sort of CRT lens comes in, and an honor to kind of the space we're in and why we're all here today. I was sitting in the earlier session this morning thinking about, like, how was I influenced? Because I remember having conversations with Professor Harris, with Cheryl Harris, telling her, I'm not really a CRT person, because I'm not really like a theoretical person, Cheryl. And she said to me, and it's something mantra I think about every time I write, which is, Jyoti, theory comes from practice. Like, theory comes from actual lived experiences that people have. All the articles you heard about this morning were drawn from real cases, real experiences. And so you have something to offer if you have practice. So I was thinking about, what Cheryl said to me. Of course, we think about intersectionality, which frames everything that I do. Professor Harris teaching us that whiteness is property, and thinking about who owns the state, who owns these laws that we now sort of subscribe to. Thinking about Devon's acting white, which is performance, and how we think about performing disability, performing normalcy. Thinking about Professor Gomez's mapping race and motherhood. Some of her early work was about motherhood and mapping sort of race, and how we think about putting on race. I think about Jerry Kong's implicit bias. I mean, I feel like here with the IDA, it's explicit bias, but we can call it implicit bias. The law would like to tell us it's implicit, even though we see that it's explicit. Of course, I'm constantly inspired by Jerry Lopez's rebellious lawyering, which is telling me to constantly think outside the box, both in my advocacy and in my writing, and now most currently in my research, which is hard. It's hard to think outside the box, right? It's much easier to stay in the box. If you want it easy, stay in the box. Don't go outside the box. Thinking about self-determination, which is Professor Bali's work, and thinking about how we think about that. I think about that in my work now. Achume's racial barriers and bringing in international law. More recently, I'm starting to incorporate more international norms, because when you sort of get tired of not having any standard here in the United States, you have to look outside to, like, how can we do things differently? Thinking about Professor Ochen, who's in the room, about her concept of sort of shackling women, shackling mothers, and the concept of motherhood and personhood, and that very much influences my work today. And then, of course, Kay-Sue Parks, thinking about history, right, enslavement. I mean, I could go on and on, but I'm naming the ones that I just remembered in my session this morning. And that brings me to kind of the first article I wrote around disability, which is a couple of years old now. And what I think is relevant, Vivian's going to talk about the IDEA, which is the law, the special education law, because she's really the expert. But what I want to read to you, because again, CRT brought me to sort of thinking about the history. Where does this labeling, right? Where does this labeling come from? It took me many years to get to sit down and write an article about it after the first time that my son was being labeled. It took me a long time to get there. But when I got there, I started thinking about, where does this labeling come from? So this was back in 1973 when they were thinking about passing the law. People were concerned that it was going to racialize children. 1973, right? Like a long time ago, like when I was born, very long time ago. Perhaps the most astute observation about the potential of racializing disabilities came from Professor Oliver Hurley, a special education faculty member at the University of Georgia, who argued that special education has served to create a racialized underclass. This is from actual hearings. I pulled up the actual hearings from 1973. Special education has become the tool of society's efforts to maintain a surplus population. Its labels are glib, they are neat, they are made to order for the purposes of institutionalizing racial, class, and economic prejudices. The labeling/placement process used in special education, I submit, is an institutionalized extension of society's discriminatory responses to an outgroup, the Black and brown minorities and the poor. Labeling and placement has become a smokescreen behind which our prejudices and biases could remain unchallenged, even unrecognized. So this was in 1973. I mean, they passed the law anyway. They didn't address any of the things that Professor Hurley, no one ever listens to the professors anyway at these hearings, back then or even today. So he's submitting all this data and statements and they're just like, thank you, but we're going to continue with our IDA. So we have to look back. We heard this morning. You have to look backwards to look forwards. We have to understand the origins of this law. So when we get frustrated, when my students get frustrated, when I was teaching it, when I get frustrated, when I have, really wicked smart special education lawyer friends who say, Jyoti, I don't like the boxes, but if I don't check the boxes, my clients aren't going to get the services. So you tell me, Miss Academic, how to get rid of the boxes, but until you can get rid of those boxes, I'm going to continue to check them because like the doctor told me, your son's not going to get the services unless you check the boxes, right? So thinking about that, thinking about how we apply DisCrit and critical race studies to the thing. So that brings me now sort of to the research that I'm doing now. So, and a much longer story that I won't necessarily get into, but when I was starting to write articles, my focus was really thinking about girls. Girls with disabilities, girls generally, girls that are pregnant, girls with disabilities in the carceral system, women are generally the most underwritten about, under sort of valued in the criminal justice space. Maybe valued is not the right word, but definitely under researched, under sort of examined. And a large part of that reason, aside from all the sort of societal, patriarchal, racist reasons, is that there isn't enough data. So I remember writing my first article for UCLA, for the law review here, and the students coming back to me to say, we really like your article, professor, but you don't have enough footnotes because there's not enough data. And I was like, but this is what I see to be true. I have these cases. I know I don't have the data you need, but this is what I know to be true. And they're like, but we can't publish it if we don't have footnotes, right? So then fast forward to us doing the first Black Girls Matter hearing with Professor Crenshaw and Professor Ochen, who's in the room. We did it at Loyola, and we had a series of young girls who had been in the system come testify about their lived experiences, right? They are the experts. They've lived through these systems, the broken education system, the mental health system, the school system, and I remember starting the hearing by saying, your stories will be our footnotes. Mm-hmm. And the report, Professor Crenshaw went on to do a couple of these hearings. She ended up writing a report that Professor Ochen and I contributed to that is still kind of the seminal report on Black Girls Matter. And the report was really validating these girls' experiences. So that was, I don't know how many years ago now, a long time ago now, almost 10 years ago now, and we still don't have we still don't have the data. So I'm now at the end of the time of my clinic here at UCLA, in sitting down with the juvenile court judge, and I'm advocating for the pregnant girls to be released. This was right before COVID hit. And there's really no reason to keep pregnant girls inside a detention facility. I think I could poll the general population and they would agree. You can have a non-carceral, not locked facility and have them there if you really feel like they're a danger to society, which is that's arguable. But he said to me, professor, counselor, whatever he was calling me, he's like, I don't have any place to send these girls. Every time I send these girls to these non-carceral placement options, they AWOL or they run away. So you tell me what to do. And I said, with all due respect, Your Honor, we don't know who these girls are because it's a black box, right? We don't know who these children are. You don't give us access to these cases. Juvenile court, for a lot of reasons, is confidential. And he's like, well, why don't you write a research motion to figure that out? I didn't even know what a research motion is. So I was like, how do you write a research motion for the court? So wrote a research motion to the court, fought public defenders and DAs to get access to the files, because nobody wants to see how the sausage is made, right? Nobody really wants to see how these cases actually go through the different systems. Now have access to 200 closed case files of pregnant detained girls that were in the system over a 5-year period. And what I'm realizing is no different than what I realized when I started this endeavor a long, long time ago, which is that we still know so little about these girls. We know so little, and we know again what we're seeing, not unsurprising to anyone here in this room or anyone here at the table, that we have every single one of these girls has an unmet special education disability, unrecognized, sometimes recognized. We have all their education records, so these are all girls that were pregnant at some point during their time in the system. We have access to their school records, but their IEPs, their individual education placements, which is what you need to sort of get the services that I just talked about, are completely outdated. I mean, I think my co-researcher is here with me today, Dr. Salazar. I don't know how, on average, we haven't run the data, but I would say like 5 years at least out of touch, if at all, there's been an IEP, right? So, I mean, unpacking the role that disability has played in these pregnant girls' trajectory will in and of itself be a huge task, but is one that is continually emerging. And so I tell you that story because I want to tell you how the different ways you can use this, kind of to the point that Jamelia ended on, which is that I want to encourage everyone, because I feel like I needed that encouragement, to think about how all of the ways in which you think about this work can influence the work that you do, whether it's academic work, whether it's practical work, whether it's research, whether it's writing. And I encourage you to draw from your personal experiences. I feel like the beauty of CRS and this space, unlike other spaces in academia where you're actually advised to keep it separate, right? Like not to make it personal because it'll somehow make you less academic. I feel like in this space, it's okay to draw from that. I feel like that's what gives it the richness. Like that's what I want to read about. I want to read about how this work connects to you and why you do the work you do. I want to know your positionality and your orientation to the work because it matters to me before I spend time reading like some really extra long paper. Why I'm reading it is I want to know like why am I reading this paper? Like who are you and what are you about? So, thank you.
So I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm gonna pull that up.
It's gonna be so good. See, look.
Yeah.
The most basic
Me too, mine are so basic.
Okay, so I don't think these two needed to introduce themselves because they're giants in the field, but I probably do. My name is Vivian Wong. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an education attorney, and I run the Youth Justice Education Clinic, which is situated at Loyola Law School, so not too far from here. But I graduated from UCLA in 2017, and actually Professor Nanda was my clinical professor, and I basically followed her everywhere she went and followed in her footsteps. So it is a huge honor and privilege to be alongside her and also Professor Morgan as well. So I, these two are obviously the experts. I could listen to them all day. But I'm really here to talk about my work and how I incorporate CRT principles into my day-to-day. So let's see. I want to start too by stating quite plainly that I am a disabled woman of color. It's a very visible disability. I was born like this, and it is a journey to identify with your disability over time. It's an evolving process, right? And I have to say, I'm tired. Who else is tired? Right? I am tired of, it's been a really long week, but as I get older, I get more tired of living in a world that is not designed for me, for my body, for my needs. Even right now, I'm trying to sit as comfortably as I can in a chair that isn't quite made for me, with my body in mind. And that's no shade on anyone. I could have requested an accommodation, but again, right, you have to go through the process, which is constructed, right? So I think a lot of the work that I do, I bring that compassion of that lived experience to the young people that I serve. So in our clinic, we represent young people who have been criminalized and pushed out of schools due to their various vulnerable identities. So that might be because of their race, their disability, their gender identity, immigration status. And my work is really centered around the idea that schools are sites of criminalization. I think everyone here kind of understands that. And even when I was in law school, term that was being used was the school to prison pipeline. Has everyone heard of the school to prison pipeline, right? The process of pushing students out of schools and into the criminal legal system. But today, I'm using the term school prison nexus, which is a term that was actually born in the early 2000s, and Subini has written extensively on this. I'm sure others have as well. I think it's increasingly getting more traction among the field because it is a more accurate description of what is really happening. So I will talk about that. I think that before I begin, a lot of my clients are young people who because they've been criminalized, are inside juvenile detention facilities, and in California, they still have a right to an education. So that's really important to remember as I continue to speak about them. So I think that we've already talked about anti-Black racism and ableism. I always present these definitions at the top because it's important to recognize that it kind of starts in schools, right? These constructs, these ideas, these systems of who we view as worthy really begins in our education system. So from a very early age, we are taught in schools who is valuable, who is worthy. And we see that through labels, but through tracking, right? Who knew about special education or gifted and talented programs, right? AP honors classes. There are all these different ways that the education system has taught us that certain people are smarter or have more potential to go farther in life. And then the opposite or the opposite side of that spectrum are people who will go nowhere, right? Who have lower expectations of themselves, and who are seen as less valuable. All of that is based on our ideas of capitalism and colonialism, eugenics, anti-Blackness, and so all of that is really captured in our education system. So our education system, again, is deeply rooted in this anti-Black racism and ableism. There are many examples of how that manifests even today, right? It's not just a historical issue. We see that continuing today. Consider the anti-literacy laws that were prevalent in the 1740s, the 1840s, that actually made it illegal to teach Black people how to read, right? We think of that as a relic, but when you consider that the young people who are sitting in juvenile detention facilities, supposedly attending juvenile court schools, many of them, almost all of them, have second to third grade reading levels and need evidence-based reading interventions. There are about 400 plus students inside who really need that kind of support. And yet our county has not really invested in providing a reading specialist who is trained to solve this issue. Consider the ugly laws. Who here has heard of the ugly laws? Well, I'm in the right room. Oh, thank you. So thank you. The ugly laws. So the ugly laws were local laws that criminalized people with physical disabilities. Jamelia talked about this as well. And we continue to see that today, right? That houseless people, many of whom would qualify as people with disabilities, continue to be criminalized. We also see that in segregation, right? Segregation we have a dark history of overt segregation in our schools. And after Brown v. Board of Education, there was a mandate to desegregate, but many schools refused to do so, right? So desegregation actually peaked in the 1980s. And today, and especially in Los Angeles, we have more segregated schools than we've had ever before. And I think that's even more relevant for students with disabilities when we consider that there are still segregated settings for students with who qualify for special education. So the only difference now being that seemingly it's a choice, right? That parents and family members agree to place students in these segregated settings, also known as non-public schools. But the counterpart to that is also we We have continuation schools that are actually very similar to these non-public schools. And these are pretty much alternative education settings that only really exist because our education system is one size fits all, right? And doesn't really meet the needs of all students. At the top of this, I talked about how this physical space is not designed for me and doesn't really incorporate universal design principles. The same thing with our education system. If our education system was designed to meet the needs of all students, then students wouldn't be pushed out of schools into these alternative education settings like juvenile court schools, special ed schools, charter schools, continuation schools. We're going elsewhere to get what we need. But really, the practice is that students are getting pushed out to those schools. Sorry, I need to keep up with my slides. Okay, so back to the nexus. We see that schools are becoming more and more carceral in nature. This is actually a meme that you probably have seen on the internet, which is kind of a nice way that practices, matching up with theory. And I think that whenever I go into facilities or go into schools and talk to young people, they know what's up. Like they already know this, that schools are just like prisons. When you think about your own school experience, my high school was in a giant concrete building, and we had police officers, probation officers, metal detectors, right? All of these signals that this is a carceral space with rules that if you violate them could lead to penal consequences. So this term of nexus is important distinction, right? Because the outdated term of school to prison pipeline implies that schools are safe places, that students are getting pushed out of these safe places and into a more punitive system. But really, students are getting criminalized and disciplined and excluded from schools. And that process of criminalization really begins there. I think that is made really evident when you look at the California Education Code as an example, that there are many ways that a student could violate an education code and also have penal consequences. So if you bring a deadly weapon or a firearm or an explosive or certain controlled substances, not only would that trigger a recommendation for expulsion, but that would also lead to a mandatory referral to police. And then you would open a delinquency case for that student. There are other places in the education code that you may not be as familiar with. For example, one is when you attack, assault, or make a physical threat towards a school staff member, not only does the student have to be referred to the police, but the staff, the teacher, could get fined if they don't make the report. So I think that's an example of how teachers and students are also pitted against one another and creates an unsafe atmosphere for really both parties, for all parties in the school space. So even though there are all these ways that students can be criminalized in schools, in practice, we're seeing students get criminalized for much more minor behavior. I think we talked about disorderly conduct, right? A common way that students are getting disciplined is through willful defiance suspensions. And there was a lot of advocacy for decades among organizers and attorneys and advocates to eliminate willful defiance as a suspension. And so I'll talk more about that in our later on as well. When we're thinking about who is getting disciplined, I think this goes back to the data point. You can look at the California school dashboard for suspension data, and you can even look up specific schools and school districts. It's a really good resource, but the data is limited. All of these stats here would show disproportionality across race and across student population. This is referring to students who are being suspended at least once per year. It doesn't capture students who are getting suspended multiple times in a year. So this is really the tip of the iceberg, right? I think that, my clients the clients that we serve, we're seeing all of their school records. And I ask our students to create timelines, right? Because you can really tell a lot from a student's school records. And some of our clients are getting suspended as kindergartners. Can you imagine getting disciplined as a kindergartner and internalizing what that really means? Like, I don't belong here, they don't want me here, and I'm being removed from the classroom because I don't deserve to learn, right? Because when a student is removed from the classroom, they're likely not provided any material to make up for that lost time. So I'm going to go through these stats. I think what's important here is that students with disabilities are suspended twice the rate of their non-disabled peers. And that's really not because that students with disabilities are engaging in more bad behavior, right? It's really that schools have a lack of understanding of what disability is and how it manifests in the learning space. And we're not really equipped to address those needs. When you consider that Black and Native students with disabilities are actually getting suspended more than their white peers, you really see the impact of intersectionality the impact of school discipline on these intersectional populations. And I think this is really a good opportunity to mention the idea of disability as a construct and the laws that create disability, right? So we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which creates eligibility categories for special education. And people confuse this all the time with diagnoses, which is another construct created in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, Statistical Manual of Disabilities. And these are all ways in which we have created these ideas of disability. And even though disability is a construct, the consequences of that construct are very real, right? It has consequences on what resources are actually provided to you. But the construct exists, these eligibilities exist because we have this idea that there is a limited pot of resources, right? This is also an idea, right? This idea that there's not enough for everyone. But a lot of these accommodations that we're asking for don't require money to implement, and it's it limits us from thinking more transformatively about what we could do to have a more universal system. For eligibilities, schools are also failing to acknowledge their own implicit and explicit biases, and I think this is made more evident when you're considering that for a long time. We had what is called emotional disturbance, a special education eligibility. In recent years, I think very recently, it's been changed to emotional disability to relieve some of that stigma. But for a long time, we had emotional disturbance. And Black girls were being identified more for emotional disturbance when in fact they could have qualified for autism in particular. And so when we think about, just how we perceive Black girls and Black women and, the labels that we assign to those behaviors without really understanding how disability might manifest differently across race and across gender. So all of this, this failure to truly identify and assess students' disability-related needs leads to real consequences. Because even though an eligibility shouldn't impact what kind of classroom you get, what kind of program you receive, it in fact very much does. So the students that I work with, not all of them, or the clients that I work with, not all of them have qualified for special education because, again, they need to meet the criteria. They also have to want to engage in that service, right? We work on a stated interest model because as a disability justice activist, that's really important to me, that we do not force young people into these kinds of systems without their full consent. And so we do not advocate for anything that the young person does not actively want. So I want to tell you some examples of cases in ways that we have disrupted the criminalization for these young people. So for Nathan, he is a 14-year-old He is very high achieving. He feels a lot of pressure at home to do well in school. And so much pressure that he had high anxiety and depression, and put a lot of pressure on himself to also do well. He didn't want to disappoint his family, being first generation, and holding that burden for his family. He was never evaluated for special education services, even though he was visibly anxious and withdrawn in certain classes. So one day he actually finds a razor blade on the ground outside of the school. He picks it up, without really thinking about it, but he picked it up to plan to cut himself with that razor blade. So he brings it to school, and he's playing with it in class, and his friend dares him to cut her with it, as kids do. These are 14-year-olds. And he does without really thinking about it, which shows that impulsivity as well. And they laugh about it. She didn't seem like in much pain until later on the day. She did go to the nurse, and then when they found out, they ended up recommending him for expulsion for bringing a knife to school, and that triggered a delinquency case. So when we got involved, we advocated for Nathan and initiated a special education assessment, which actually halted the expulsion proceedings until we were able to really understand the full extent of Nathan's needs and how to better address them. And we were actually able to get the expulsion case completely thrown out. And then we brought the update to juvenile court. Because the only reason why he had an open delinquency case was because of this school-based incident. And the juvenile court judge said, okay, great, it's resolved. We're going to close the delinquency case as a result. So not only were we able to resolve the school issues and actually get him more support, we were also able to eliminate the legal case for him as well. So that's a win for Nathan. Avery is also a student who was denied, a 16-year-old student who was denied special education services despite having a lot of attention needs. She had a lot of difficulty paying attention in class, and it was very clear that if she didn't need special education, she definitely needed accommodations, which would have also triggered protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So because of the hardening of school discipline practices and really a rise in school shootings and political rhetoric, increasing fear in our communities, we have the Gun-Free School Zone Act, which makes it illegal to bring guns to school, but also to possess guns at school. So that makes sense, right? We want to deter students from bringing guns into schools. But because the law is written so that if anyone possesses a gun on a school campus, you are automatically recommended for expulsion. So it doesn't resolve the issue when a student finds a gun on a school campus and doesn't know what to do with it, which is exactly what happened here. So our client did not bring the gun to school, but picked it up when it fell to the floor during a huge fight that was open in the quad. It turned out her boyfriend actually brought the gun. That's always the boyfriend, in my experience. And she picked it up out of impulsivity, and she also didn't want anyone else to use it. So she picks it up and runs, which looks really bad. But she also didn't know what to do with it, right? She thought that if she turned it in, she would get into trouble, which, in fact, she did get into trouble. When she tried to give it to someone else, it was a whole big mess. And so we made these arguments at the expulsion hearing, explaining that you actually need a policy for what to do when you find a gun on these school campuses. This case actually she was referred to law enforcement because of this incident, and then had to advocate in that space as well. But at the expulsion hearing, those arguments were actually impactful, and the panel agreed that she should not be expelled. So we brought the case to the juvenile court judge, and we were actually able to advocate for diversion, 654 diversion on that case. So after being on probation for 6 months, informal probation, the case completely was off her record. So that was great too. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over Corey, unfortunately. But all of these cases, I think that it shows that meeting these eligibilities is a really difficult task, but is also necessary to obtain necessary resources, right? Helpful resources for students. And I think that something that I see a lot in my work is juvenile court judges tell me, well, everyone has a disability now, or everyone has ADHD, or everyone has trauma. And I want to tell them, like, yes, and we should talk about that. That's maybe a problem, right? So I think that they're almost there, but not quite, in their understanding of actually how students with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by the school-prison nexus. So when we talk about how to actually dismantle this giant system and all the violent practices that we see in schools, like school police and high-stakes standardized testing and exclusionary school discipline, the work that we do really focuses on looking at budgets, right? Looking at how we spend the money in our systems. So can anyone guess what these numbers represent?
Incarceration cost per young person, and then education cost in sort of school.
Precisely. So 770,000 is how much we spend on detaining one young person in LA County Juvenile Hall, which is supposed to be a short-term placement. And really, students should be there on average 10 days. I think my clients are there for much longer. And we actually just released a report about how the county has historically failed to educate incarcerated youth. But this number on the other side is 22,000, which is the cost of educating a young person in LAUSD. Is anyone shocked by this?
No.
Right? Right. Disappointed for sure. And I think this is, I've seen these numbers in newspaper articles, on billboards. The information is out there, right? And why do people let this happen?
Oh, what's the time period? Like for 1 year, it's
For
22?
1 year.
1 year.
Yeah.
For both 1 year.
Yes. For one person, for one young person. So when you, again, always looking at the money, right, where we invest, there's a lot of advocacy happening in LA County specifically to reimagine our youth justice system. We call it Youth Justice Reimagined. It's this whole plan to actually eliminate juvenile probation completely and invest in youth development. Sounds great, right? And our LA County Board of Supervisors actually approved this vision in 2020. But since then, we've actually failed to implement the budget and all of the decisions needed to implement this vision. So we have created a new county department, the Department of Youth Development, but probation's budget just keeps growing. They have a $1 billion budget now, and I encourage anyone who's interested to get involved and show up to LA County Board of Supervisors meetings. Anyone can do it, anyone can provide public comment, and it is really important to do so. I want to go back to, this is a lot of the systemic work that we do in the clinic, but I want to talk about willful defiance in particular, because willful defiance, I think, really demonstrates how vague, right, all of this is. Right, and very subjective, and an easy way to project your own implicit biases. So willful defiance, what does it mean to you all?
The problem was authority.
Problem with authority, right? Not listening to your teachers, And it could really mean anything. So it could be wearing a hoodie in class, talking on the phone. One of the school discipline records that I read was that the teacher told the student, "Stop eating Cheetos in my class," and the student looked at the teacher and ate a Cheeto. So, you could probably say, yeah, that sounds willfully defiant. But really, that willful defiance means really differently for one person to the next. And so it took lots of organizing, but in 2024, we passed SB 274, which eliminated willful defiance suspensions for all students, all K-12 students, until 2029, which hopefully we can then advocate again to eliminate it completely for forever. But this was a huge victory, built upon years and years of organizing, and still school districts are still suspending students for willful defiance. So I think it just goes to show that the victories are there, but we have to remain vigilant to make sure that these victories are being implemented properly. So I'm going to end it there.
All right, I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about funding, what the sources are. Is it all like stuff that has to be passed by county boards, or like what is it that makes the school? What I'm most interested in is understanding what makes the schools so tight on giving resources and like denying people.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Because there's a lot of the funding that schools receive is based on state funding. There is definitely a portion of it that comes from the federal government, but it actually isn't as much as the state portion. And so you're probably hearing a lot about federal budget cuts, which is absolutely impacting schools' ability to provide special education services in particular, because that is based on a federal law. But a lot of the funding is actually being provided by the state governments. And so I think, hopefully that answers part of your question. I think when you're talking about police departments, because a lot of school districts will contract with local police departments to provide their school policing, that comes from more county dollars, tax dollars, and there are ways to also apply for more funding through state and federal agencies.
And it's political, depending on your school board. Because your school board gets to decide also how much money you allocate for school police. And you also see in the wealthier school districts that you have parent groups that raise money for the school. So, no two school districts are the same. No two schools even within a school district are the same. Because it depends on the parent level of involvement and outside funding. So all of that, it's super complicated. But the school boards actually do have a lot of power when it comes to school police. And some just rubber stamp.
Yeah, I wanted to thank all of you. I think that as a student who is white and male, but also who is formerly incarcerated and has a disability, I think that there's a lot of intersections that I had, and I think that you guys made this a very safe space. You also very talked about where empirical data comes in. I think that that's where my question is for Ms. Nanda. I knew you said a research motion, so I hadn't heard about that. And I think that a lot of things that, I have noticed that the law seems to, falter where there's no data. And once data is brought in, then the court's oh, okay, where they're actually, they're not recognizing law review articles, they're recognizing empirical studies. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because I never heard of a research motion before.
Hopefully you're right that they will recognize it. And thank you for being here and sharing that part of yourself with us. Research motion is a motion that I filed, and I'm happy to share it. Get my email and I'm happy to share it. I'm happy to share it with anyone if they want to see it. But it's actually a motion that I attached a requested data set request to the motion, and I had to file it, and it's called a memorandum of points of authorities for research or something like that. So it's an actual motion, and I actually had to work with the juvenile law clerk to ask them, how do I file this? Because I didn't know myself, right? And then had to work through how to write it out. And I mean, really credit to the juvenile court. I mean, the juvenile court judge herself would, presiding judge at the time, would write me back and be like, actually, you need to fill this out. Like, this needs to be explained a little bit more. This needs to be explained a little bit more, because I had no template. But it exists, and I was able to attach the data request about what I needed, and then hope that it, and to be fair to the public defenders, I said earlier that they, so they had an opportunity then. So what happens is that you then have to copy every department in the county where anybody's ever had a case connected to it, if that makes sense. So of course, every department gets triggered, and then their lawyers have an opportunity to reject. So then they write a motion and rejecting it, an opposition, a motion in opposition. And the public defenders opposed it because of the confidentiality concerns. I mean, that was their main concern, to be fair to them, but they really fought me hard. And public defenders are like, I think, some of the best lawyers in the world, so they came back hard. So then it was like I had to then write like a response to all of their objections and ensure them that the confidentiality protocols were going to be in place, and that our team was going to be really small. And the reason why it's taken so long is because our team is almost like too small, but I have to keep it really tight, right? Because this information is so important and like has to be so protected. And so that was sort of the back and forth that we did, but it gave us sort of access. And I've shared it with like other NGOs and nonprofits that unfortunately have not been as successful in getting the research, because again you think about which institutions judges privilege, right? So like I'm coming in as an academic. Had I come in with like a nonprofit, somehow like I'm less worthy of the data, right? And so I do think that there is also like a way in which systems recognize authority in ways that are different, that we also have to sort of name. It's to my advantage now in this moment, but it could be then to my disadvantage in another moment. So I do think that there's also like some strategy as well in how to apply for that.
It's also really, like, the confidentiality issue is a really good example of when exercising one's individual rights can somehow like prevent more systemic change. It's really interesting.
I also want to echo thank you. This is my first time being in a space talking about it's very hard. It's my first time really learning about DisCrit, and in undergrad I studied ethnic studies and critical race theory. We never really talked about disability justice, and now I'm earning my master's in the social welfare department, and we're utilizing the DSM. We're talking about disability, talking about people with quote unquote psychiatric conditions in such a pathologizing and ableist way. And just someone who's system impacted, was arrested when I was in high school. I have two disabilities, one being a quote unquote serious mental illness. It's crazy. I've never heard someone say quote unquote before saying mental illness, right? Like in the space I'm in all day long. So it's been very present for me right now. Just the institutional ableism and fighting even with the disabilities department here
Yeah. Oh yeah.
for my accommodations.
That's so real.
I told them I refuse to let you all get in the way of my academic and professional success because you want to deploy institutional ableism. I'm tired. But essentially my question was around sort of like literature research around like carceral replications in hospitals and psychiatric facilities and residential programs, and the quote unquote troubled teen industry, right? That was very unregulated, where they're sending kids who have mental health issues or disabilities and or truant or too defiant to these programs. I was sent to a juvenile diversion program. I mean, fortunately, I didn't come back traumatized. I appreciated the program, but just what kind of conversations, literature, I don't know.
I'm just glad that you're here, that you're in this space. and just to kind of affirm that feeling of just seeing yourself. That's I think why Subini meant so much to me and why the folks on this panel, we're in community, we're in conversation, we're learning together. Just as to the literature, I think it's interesting to look around the room and to think about the people that are writing on some of these things, and I'm happy to follow up because I get the privilege of like studying this stuff and trying to put out the resources. So to think about kind of the carceral hospital medical connection, Jisun's song right here.
I was thinking
Sunita Patel, also a professor here, happy to send you there. We'll just connect to get our resource, but for everybody. Professor Song and Patel are the leading scholars on that front and working deep in community to do their research. The troubled teen industry, Jordan is at the Center for Racial and Disability Justice with me. We're actually trying to produce resources around that because you spotted something it took us a few years to identify. So we've just turned to looking at that as well. But there's so much more. We've tried to collect as many resources as we can on our website. But I'd like to follow up because I mean your
so
work,
much,
you're, like
so
there's
much.
I'm just looking at like there's a
There's so
lot that I
much.
want to bring in, and especially coming out of the critical race studies sort of space. Like Priscilla, your work helped me understand disability, which is so interesting because it was thinking about status for me. Right, so I want to send you the status crime paper that Priscilla wrote. So it's like Professor Oshen wrote. So there's a lot that I'd like to share, but I just want to affirm like it is liberating to see your full self recognized in these spaces that were about excluding us, as some of the points you were making earlier, Vivian. And I just want to just affirm that, right? Where, like I said, I have invisible impairments. Some of us live with the visible, but we face that internalized, externalized ableism in so many ways, especially in the education setting where we're here to learn, we're here to grow, and we're disciplined so severely. And that many people have faced the consequences of that, I'm sure.
And I invite you to write as well.
Yes.
And ableism
I
impacts
invite you to write.
everyone,
Yeah.
not
Yes.
just people with disabilities.
Yes.
If you're a student, you said you're a student in the social work program, so I mean, I encourage you and we're here to help you do that because I think you, just based on what you said, have a lot to offer.
Mike?
So I'll be quite brief, but I wanted to really expound upon DisCrit as a methodology to be taken other places. So I'd love to share with folks some other places it's been taken. So I'm a second year here in the law school and then a fifth year PhD in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford under Dr. Annamma. And so very full circle. So I could talk
We
at
should have
length.
had you on the panel.
Yeah. Justice, but I could for sure talk at length about kind of our current project, which is wrapping up. It's been a 4-year. It's called DisCrit Incarcerated. The trajectories of incarcerated youth, very much applying DisCrit to the carceral setting in youth spaces. And a lot of the data that we've gotten has really just echoed all the things that we've known about disability being overrepresented, about youth of color being overrepresented. So that's one context, but it's also been used quite recently to criticize medical education and the pushing out of students of color in that realm. So for my fellow law students, it's maybe a great solid paper topic to do for law school, very applicable as well. And then two kind of current iterations. One is a kind of reflexive talk about what it is like to do research in carceral spaces as someone who's also formerly incarcerated, but is also now like a quantitative scholar in the critical race space. All those things matter, and how kind of the oppressiveness of carceral spaces affect everyone, not just the youth, but the staff, even the people at the top. We've written on that, and then the final one that I think might be quite salient to the moment is we're putting the work in conversation with Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who writes quite a bit about Palestinian children, and we have a framework of unchilding, which we contrast with adultification. Both are happening to kids, but we put that in conversation with the malice of purposeful forgetting, and to draw linkages between the youth that we've seen incarcerated here in the United States and the way that they've been unchild in Palestine. So lots of really, really incredible work that comes from this one framework that I implore people to dive into a little further.
Mike, can you say the name of the lab again so people can sort of Google it? Is it through the Racial Justice Lab?
That's right. So that's right. So it's the Walkout Lab for Youth Justice based in Stanford.
Justice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
For joining us.